Beyond Borders, a founder's journey expanding into Asia and back again. This is a consistent webinar hosted by PikoHANA, PikoHANA.com. And we are here with the CEO of PikoHANA, Matt Foley, and also a special guest, Stephen Tracy, the co-founder of Milieu Insight. So thanks a lot for joining us, Stephen. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
Excellent, excellent. And Matt, of course, how are you? This is your house.
Yeah, great. And it's a real pleasure to have Stephen here. Really excited about hearing his journey. So yeah, over to you, Will.
Excellent, excellent. So the main purpose of these webinars, if you guys missed the last one, is effectively talking about how a lot of particularly companies in Canada and the US and throughout Europe might be underutilizing Asia as a potential place for them to be able to do a lot of elements within their finance. So today we have somebody who's actually in, Stephen, you feel free to tell your background, where you're based, what's your background, how familiar are you with Asia, and just kind of give us a full intro in terms of why you might be here on this webinar.
Yeah, for sure. So my background, I'm originally from Toronto area. I grew up here. I went to school in Toronto, did both my undergrad and master's degree. And then when I graduated back in 2011, I actually moved out to Singapore. I got my first job as a digital analyst at a big ad agency called McCann World Group. Originally, I'd planned to go out to Singapore for a couple of years to work, and that turned into 13 years. I spent the first 7 of those years working for some of the world's biggest ad agencies, so IPG, Publicis. And my background, I'm a data scientist by training, and I worked in that field for a while. And then after about 7 years, I joined a company called Milieu Insight as a late stage co-founder. So there were 3 other founders that had started the company. I joined shortly after the company was started. And then I helped drive that company and scale it over the course of 6 years. And then recently, so actually just last week marked my 1 year of moving back to Canada. So after 13 years, I decided to come home and be close to family again. And so I came back and left the place that I had called home for 13 years, and both professionally and non-professionally. And yeah, I've got and the transition back was fascinating. I've got lots of interesting stories to share, but also like being able to have worked in big corporate jobs, but also in the startup space in Asia and in Singapore was especially exciting. And I think I have a lot to share because I've met a lot of founders now in Canada that also they don't really think much about expanding beyond the United States, and I think that is I think that's a problem. And I think that's something that people, if they really are thinking about building a business and building something that scales globally, they need to be thinking beyond North America. So happy to share that today.
That's so interesting because, I definitely agree that, oftentimes a lot of companies don't think about Asia when it comes to expansion. And, before we kind of get into some of it, do you have any opinions as to why that's the case? Why this region in particular might not necessarily be on the first or top 3 regions that they think about with expansion? Do you have any tricks of the trade or insights on why that might be the case?
Well, the reality is, the United States is the world's biggest market overall. And any company or any founder that is not based in the United States and is building a company is generally thinking about a US entry because it is an enormous market. It depends on the sector you're in. But, any investor or accelerator will tell a founder, like, you have to have an entry plan for the United States. But I think that message sometimes gets they hyper focus on the opportunities or they hyper focus on the US as a sole market to expand to. And don't get me wrong, the United States for most businesses is a very valuable and important place to eventually set up. But I mentioned this before, I think to build a truly global business, you have to be across continents. You have to think about ASEAN, you have to think about EMEA and other places as well. But I think the reason for that happens is just because it is so big. That founders tend to hyper focus on it. And the other thing too is that, again, I'm thinking about founders that are not based in the US but are entering that market. it is such a challenging and costly thing to expand into a market like the United States that I can understand why people tend to forego or not think about other regions of the globe as much. So, yeah.
Understood. Well, great. Well, let's get into it, guys. Effectively, the kind of first portion of this is something that's actually quite common. The most expensive words a founder can say is, "We'll figure all this out later." You know what? Yeah, I totally understand everything you guys are saying in this webinar. In fact, it's very interesting to me. But you know what? I'll get around to it. Maybe in 2027, maybe in Q3 2028. What do you guys have to say about that? I mean, I'm sure it's common, but also the most expensive words anybody can say. And, what are some of your perspectives on how to advise people to act now and be a little bit more, intentional with their actions with something like this?
Well, I think the challenge of starting a business is the most challenging thing you'll ever do. It's nonstop, and especially if you're thinking about raising capital and you're bringing on investors, there's going to be expectations to be running 1,000 miles a minute, and to build a successful business, you have to. I think one of the problems with like planning for things like global expansion is that if you don't plan for it and try to act on it early on, it just gets put, you put a pin in it and you never get to it. It's very easy to get stuck in the daily grind of all the things you have to do as a founder and put something kind of in the backlog, and it just always gets pushed away. And the idea of like, again, expanding to additional markets, it's challenging. There's a lot of unknowns. You need to for most founders, you won't know where to start. So you just need to kind of go into this black hole and kind of do research and start looking into, how to do it, how to set up a legal entity, all that stuff. And I think that the founders that I've seen that have expanded and kind of broken out of the market where they were founded, they started doing this very quickly. They had a plan for expansion early on, and your plans will change. You'll hit challenges along the road, and you'll decide to focus on this market or this product instead of something you thought of from the beginning. But even though your plans change, the founders that I've seen kind of move the fastest and really crack kind of global expansion, they had planned it from day one.
Yeah, one thing I would add to that as well is that the expansion and the establishment of new entities in ASEAN in particular, one of the things that always get put back on the back burner is the accounting, finance, and support. And I can't tell you how many times we've ended up helping companies who have, at last realized that they need to get their house in order. And that's a lot of times driven by the fundraising event that you spoke about, Stephen. That they go into this process and they suddenly realize they're not prepared for that. And that creates all kinds of challenges. It can be quite costly. It can create delays for them as far as the fundraising process itself. So it's a key issue. You mentioned compliance, not only compliance, but that feeds into your support, your accounting support, finance, operational. So it's really important to address these issues up front and have a handle on that.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And for any founder building a SaaS or tech platform, they're familiar with this term technical debt, which is something every tech founder needs to incur, because generally you build things fast in the beginning, but you have to reduce that technical debt. Technical debt is basically things you have to fix from how you built it originally. And I like to think of the concept as known as operational debt, which is if you make really bad decisions or poor decisions that you can't fix early on, you're going to incur a debt to that in the long term. And that can be things like how you set up your corporate entities and how you structure your business. And it's not to say you have to get it perfect from day one, but if you don't fix these things early on, you're going to feel the pain of it, I think, long term.
So you mentioned a couple things that are interesting to me. So you spent 6 years building Milieu Insight. that was headquartered out of Singapore, but you guys were obviously expanding across the region. So what were some of the challenges you faced on that front?
Yeah, I'll say, like, up front, we had challenges, but we also had like an amazing founding team. There were 4 co-founders. So there were 3 initial founders, and like I said, I joined as a late stage co-founder. We all had different areas of expertise. The CFO Calvin had a background in banking. We had the founder Gerald had a strong background in the area that we were building in research, as did I. And then Judah, the other co-founder, she had a strong background in marketing as well as research. We all had these kind of different hats, and I feel like that also helped us in ways that not all founders. Many founding teams are usually 2 people, and so they won't have that breadth of expertise that we were able to have. And I could tell you right now, if we didn't have all those different people in those seats in those early days, we would have made some big mistakes. So we had a really good founding team that had a very diverse range of experience. But there were still lots of challenges. So we expanded quite aggressively during COVID. We had just raised a round of funding shortly before all the lockdowns started happening. And a big part of that fundraise, a big part of our plans were to expand to 4 new markets. And when we decided to go ahead with it, even though we had to kind of take a pause and say to ourselves, like, hold on, like, okay, everything's happening. The world seems to be falling apart right now. Again, this was right at the beginning of the lockdowns. And so it was a very uncomfortable time. We decided to go ahead with the expansion, and it ended up paying off for us because we were able to grow quite a lot. It turns out that our sector for a while was very there was a lot of people that wanted to do research to understand what is the new normal and those kind of things. So we were able to expand quite aggressively. I think some of the challenges that we found were, when you expand all these new markets, they're very different countries. They're very different cultures. You have to, if you're setting up legal entities, everything is, there's no economies of scale here. You have to do it kind of one by one. I think one of the biggest things was like navigating the different tax systems in these different countries, because they're all very different. You start to get clients, but then you have to invoice them locally, or you have to pay invoices locally. And that can be a really big challenge. So there were many operational challenges, but I like from recall, I think navigating tax systems, different tax jurisdictions was a particular pain point.
Hire people locally, or did you find service providers, or how did you guys manage that?
We did set up local corporate entities, and we hired locally.
Right.
But like the people we hired locally were, researchers and salespeople. It's not like we had local accountants and tax experts. So we had a kind of
on the ground in these different countries, or what kind of challenges did that create?
I mean, those are probably questions that the previous. I've left Milieu now, but the CFO would probably be best to answer. But like I said, we ramped up really fast in these countries. Like I said, during COVID, and we hired salespeople who started to kind of go out, build pipeline, and as soon as you start having these deals come through, when you have to start dealing with accounts payable and accounts receivables, you need to be kind of buttoned up with all your, there was a big learning curve for that, for sure.
I'm sure.
Absolutely. So that actually goes into kind of like the next place. I mean, I know we touched on this a little bit earlier, but looking at specifically the region, so navigating these different markets, right? And let's put this really in context for Canada, right? If you were to go look at from a Canadian perspective, and the fact that as you mentioned, that focus kind of on the U.S. portion and everything like that. What can you emphasize here for particularly Canadian founders in terms of the, untapped scale that Asia brings, just so that we can kind of hammer it home, and that brings us further into the next segment.
Yeah, well, we were focused. My last startup, Milieu, was really focused on Southeast Asia before I left, and some of these markets are really big markets. So you've got countries like Thailand, Indonesia, Vietnam. Now, it really depends on the sector that you're in and the buyers, because it will vary quite a bit. But again, when you start looking at these countries or these markets together, there's a lot of volume. There's a lot of opportunity to tap into, and Singapore in particular is a phenomenal market to root yourself in as a business. It may not have the volume in terms of, like, if you don't want to expand into Asia and only try to find buyers in Singapore, it depends on what your product is. But if you are kind of hubbing your business or HQing your business out of Singapore, it's a phenomenal place to do it, because it's very founder friendly. There's access to capital. You can get bank accounts set up in an afternoon. There's access to phenomenal talents in Singapore and around the region. So it is a really, really great place to kind of root your business in, and it gives you access to all these markets. You'll see that even outside of the startup ecosystem, some of the biggest companies have a headquarters or second headquarters in Singapore, like Google, Unilever, P&G. And when you meet the people that work there in the Singapore office, they all have regional titles. They look after ASEAN or SEA. And I think that kind of illustrates just how valuable it is to be focused on not just Asia, but also looking at Singapore as a place to actually root your business in.
Absolutely.
Yeah, sorry, Will. That's spot on, Stephen. I mean, you have the multinationals here, but Singapore is a great place also to just almost do a test of your product in the market, right? And if you can get past that proof of concept in Singapore, a lot of these companies we see expand very fast in the region. So Singapore is kind of like that petri dish, right? Where you can test the market, you can roll your product out on a limited basis, or full-fledged, market entry into Singapore, and then expand regionally. It does make for an excellent headquarters for ASEAN.
And let's kind of jump into that a little bit, like, in terms of wealth preservation and kind of like how this really rolls itself out. So that kind of is a perfect segue into this space. Now, how does it really apply? Like, if you were to be a Canadian founder, I'm sure they're going to say, what's in it for me? How am I secure? What happens? What do I get out of this? And I think that's kind of where we're at in this segment.
And sorry, William, the question is about, like, the context for this is Canadian founders looking to expand into Asia and like how their mindset.
Yes, exactly. I mean, the general theme of this expansion place, what's in it for them fully beyond just what we're kind of covering. Like, for instance, like, their founder gains, the wealth preservation component.
Yeah.
Why structuring early?
Got it. I think that this is something I'm still learning about, but I think, like, from a shareholding and taxation perspective, Singapore is, I would argue, probably more attractive than Canada as another tax jurisdiction. We can kind of get into that, and I'm sure Matt has plenty to share on that. But even outside of the shareholding and taxation of, like, private shares and things like that, the other thing that I feel that Singapore unlocks is, like, speed. There's an agility, or there's a speed that you can move to, like Matt said, test out ideas, test out your go-to-market strategy, and just scale your business. That I feel that if you're based in Canada, you just don't have access to the same kind of ecosystem and resources. It's nothing against Canada. And again, I've only been back here for a year. I have spent a lot of time in the kind of local startup ecosystem, talking to VCs, talking to founders. I even went through an accelerator, startup accelerator, when I first came back. And the momentum here seems different. And I think, like, this is a really important point for founders, because I think that, like, your shareholding, if you're thinking about the returns for you as a founder, those are directly tied to how well you can scale and how fast you can scale. And I would argue that the opportunity for you to scale is really, really high. To scale faster is really high in a market like Singapore or a region like ASEAN or SEA. So I think that's a really important message for founders, which is it like looking to a place like Singapore to headquarter or to have like a second headquarters. It unlocks the speed in which you can really grow your business.
Yeah, not only that, Stephen, I mean, that is a really important point. Alongside that is the value that you're going to attain through a more tax efficient structure. Canadian taxes on corporations are much higher than here in Singapore. So if you can basically avoid that additional taxation, you'll be able to reinvest in the business. Longer term, as the company turns profitable and is growing, that net income can actually be paid out in dividends to shareholders. And there's no dividends tax here in Singapore, and there's no capital gains tax either. So if you were to reinvest those profits into, say, the stock market, those gains on your investment would not be taxed here in Singapore. That's a big difference, comparatively speaking, with most other countries.
No, absolutely. And I think that, this leads right into the key segment, which is, Matt, how does PikoHANA specifically assist companies in doing some of this stuff? And it'd be great also to hear from Stephen as well, in terms of being that you're also familiar with PikoHANA as well, and just kind of in this region, considering everything that we're talking about, where is the edge here? Right. And if people are looking to explore with PikoHANA for this region, but also at the same time, your opinion as well, how does PikoHANA specifically support the founders in this region who might be in Canada looking to expand, et cetera?
Well, I think the primary thing that PikoHANA provides is I don't want to gentrify this maybe, but we're their man on the ground in Asia. We can set them up, have them operational, basically give them a business in the box here in Singapore to start with. And then as they're ready to expand in other countries, whether it's Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, Hong Kong, or otherwise, we can assist them in that. More importantly is that with our clients, we become key advisors. We're very important to the operations and to the founders themselves on advising them how to structure their corporate entities or the corporate structure, what they should be looking at in the case of their own personal taxation exposure, issues that they will encounter upon repatriation, most of the time to Europe or Canada. That can be quite expensive if you don't know what you're doing, and if you don't have the right advisors in place. So we bring a whole host of advisory support, seamless end-to-end back office and tax advisory to our clients. And I think in the end, they benefit from that, not only longer term as far as their wealth generation, because they're keeping more of their income, but their wealth preservation. And again, one of the key things is expats usually repatriate longer term. And if they're not prepared and they don't know what is the requirements for that repatriation from a tax perspective, they can get caught out. And that's what we really help them avoid.
And I think that's a great point for me to jump in, because I will say that as someone who just repatriated to Canada a year ago, I was fairly ignorant to the tax implications going into it. So the first thing was, when I left Singapore, it triggered, because I was an EP and I was leaving Singapore, it triggered a dry tax on my shareholding, which was kind of a scary thing. But I had really supportive co-founders, and we got through it. But then when I got to Canada, I found out find out that Canada will take capital gains on anything. So if I ever sell shares, or there's an exit event, then I get taxed at a really high rate on those gains. Now, there's obviously different solutions or different ways to structure this, but it was quite shocking. And when I had to find partners, or I figured, okay, I can just go find an accountant who can helped me understand this. And the reality is that, like, first of all, your average accountant or someone that helps you with tax matters doesn't know much about how to deal with private shareholdings. And it gets even worse if you're trying to find someone who, or it's harder to find a partner who can deal with cross-border taxation and the implications of shareholdings. And the other thing is, there are so many different types of ESOP programs. You could have shares as RSUs, you can have shares as share options and things like that. And you have to make sure that you find a partner that can advise you on these things. And the reality is that partner, I think what I've learned is that that partner is not necessarily going to be an accountant. You might find a firm that deals with cross-border taxation and they know this stuff. But even if you do, they might only specialize in US to Canada or the UK to Canada. It's just hyper specialized. So being able to find a partner who just knows about this space and can kind of give you guidance and is familiar with local tax laws and things like that is really, really important. Doing it early is also really important. You do not want to do this kind of thing when you're about to relocate or when you're about to do something that triggers a tax event. And it doesn't have to be just a relocation. You know, I've met lots of co-founders or founders that got into real cash flow issues when they were exiting, because as the process of exiting was occurring, they had to come up with, say, a couple $100,000 to be able to pay for options before the money hit their account. So there's lots of interesting things that can happen here for founders or even employees with shares. And I think, you know, the most important thing is to plan early and seek out a partner who can guide you and advise you on these things.
Absolutely, absolutely. And thanks so much for that insight as well, Stephen. So we are actually coming to the half hour, and it looks like we've got a lot of pieces. Is there any component you guys still wanted to kind of shout out or emphasize, Matt and Stephen? This is the Scale Beyond Borders. Well, we also put without regret, of course. And here's the QR code to be able to contact us. That's sales@pikohana.com. We do have another webinar coming up next, which is incorporating in Singapore, set up smarter, scale faster, different title. But, you know, great to get some closing words from you, Stephen, and also, of course, take us home, Matt Foley, after that.
Yeah, I think as a closing part, probably the common theme from this is like planning ahead. And for any founder who's just starting their journey, if they're in the 0 to 1 startup, it's like there's a lot of noise. And again, you're running 1,000 miles a minute. But that's not a good reason to not like take the time to come up with a strategy for things like global expansion or offshoring or entry into a market like Singapore. It is something you have to do early on. And what I would recommend is that you plan ahead, you even do some recon. Like if you're a Canadian founder who is looking at expanding into Singapore or Southeast Asia, you know, book a trip out to Singapore, go line up meetings with different types of people or agencies, potential partner agencies that can help you get access to clients, finance firms, tax firms, etc. And you know, the first time I met Matt, he immediately was, when I started talking to him about different things like taxation, shareholdings, he immediately had this breadth of knowledge that was really impressive. And I've learned a lot from him on matters of like cross-border taxation and things like that. And I think it illustrates the importance of finding partners. You do not want to just show up to a new country that you're expanding to and hire 1 or 2 people and hope for the best. It's not going to work out for you. So you need to make sure that you plan ahead. Like I said, do recon, book a trip, go into the market, line up some meetings, and start building partnerships before you go in. And I would highly recommend that you speak to someone like Matt when it comes to anything from taxation to corporate structuring and things like that.
I mean,
Absolutely.
I couldn't have said it better, Stephen. You kind of stole the thunder there.
Sorry to take your thunder.
Look, firstly, I want to thank you and Will for coming on, especially yourself. That was really interesting. I guess the only thing I would say otherwise is if this resonates with any of our audience and they're facing these challenges or interested in expanding to Asia, feel free to reach out. we're happy to have the chat. So thank you, Stephen. Really insightful. Thank you, Will.
Absolutely, absolutely. Always a pleasure to do these. And Stephen, thanks so much for joining us for Scaling Beyond Borders with PikoHANA. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Scaling Beyond Borders.